Now, do you see what they're doing? Creationists believe God created the animals and plants just as we see them today, but evolutionists, Darwin, believe that animals change, and you go out and you have a look, animals change, therefore evolution's true. Now, here's what they do. After you read these signs, you then go through all these exhibits. I remember there being with my wife once, and we went over there a number of times, and we're walking around the exhibit and said, okay, let's have a look at the exhibit. So the first one was dogs. And they say, see, dogs change. And you look at that and you say, yep, dogs change. I can see that. And then you walk past another one, horses, and you say, look at the differences in horses. Yeah, there are differences in horses, aren't there? Yep, horses change. And then they say, look at these moths. And you look at them and say, yeah, they're a little different, aren't they? Obviously the same kind, but there are changes. And then you look at these rabbits, and you say, rabbits change. Yeah, they change into millions of rabbits, don't they? But rabbits do change, and there's some little differences in rabbits. Look at these ducks. There's some differences in those ducks. You say, yes, there are differences in those ducks. And then you come to the daisies, and they say, see, all the differences in the daisies. And you look there and say, yeah, look at the little differences. Subtle differences, but there are differences there. And then we came to another display. This one was about weasels. This is my favorite display at the British Museum of Natural History, because when I came to the weasels, the sign they had on the weasels caused me to levitate 3 feet off the ground. I mean, really, it was phenomenal. It's an experience that I wanted to share with you. You're going to levitate 3 feet off the ground when you read this as well. I mean, it is phenomenal. You really read this. It was almost like a religious experience, a spiritual experience, just reading this sign. You watch. When weasels breed together, they produce more weasels like themselves. I mean, did that grip your heart like it gripped mine? I mean, it really read that, and then you look at the sign and the picture, and it says, here are the weasels, and they produce more weasels, and say, wow, that's true, that does happen. Well, anyway, we left the weasels, and then when you get to the end of all these displays, I want you to have a look what they wrote. In this exhibition, we have tried to show how Darwin's theory of natural selection can explain how living things evolved. Whoa, do you see what they did? They started at the beginning. Creationists believe God created everything just as we see today. Evolutionists believe animals change and plants change. Now let me show you. See, horses change, dogs change, cats change, etc. They all change. And now, therefore, living things evolved. Do you see what they've done? So they're setting up this straw man. They're teaching you incorrectly about what creationists believe. And then they use the word evolution to apply to changes in dogs, changes in rabbits, changes in horses and so on. And then at the end, they use the word evolution to say living things evolve, meaning molecules to man. And you know what, students? That's exactly how students in the public schools, secular colleges are indoctrinated, and they don't realize what's happening to them. Now, I know when we got to that sign there, my wife said, well, wait a minute. I didn't see evolution. Can we go around again? We must have missed something. I said, sure, let's go around again. So we went around again. So first of all, we looked at the dogs, right? And as we looked at the dogs, we said, you know what? That's right. There are changes in dogs. Yes, that's true. And then we looked at the horses. Said, yeah, there's a change in the horses. And then we looked at the moths, changes in moths. And then we looked at the rabbits, yeah, changes in rabbits there. And then we looked at the ducks, yes, changes in ducks. And we looked at the daisies, and we came to the weasels again. And we stood and we contemplated. Weasels produce weasels. Wow. And then we read the sign again. Here it is. Darwin's theory of natural selection explains how living things evolved. Whoa, wait a minute. What did we see? We saw dogs, we saw horses, we saw moths, we saw rabbits, we saw ducks. What do you mean, evolution? See, they're implying molecules to man evolution is true because changes in animals, which they call evolution, is true. Now, let me show you what really is going on here. Now, I don't know how many dogs there were at the beginning. When God created, if all dogs are one kind, let's assume he created 2 dogs. There are probably more than 2 dogs that he created, but let's say 2 dogs. Okay, they got married, had kids, and we end up with some dogs. More dogs. They got married, had kids, we end up with more dogs. They got married and have kids, we get more dogs again. They got married and have kids, and it goes on and on and on, and we end up with lots of dogs. Okay, so now we have lots of dogs. Okay, people say, but that doesn't explain how you get dingoes and coyotes and wolves and jackals and so on. Well, you know, in genetics, we use a convention to talk about genes. We label them according to the letters of the alphabet, like big A, big B, little b, big C, little c. That's how we label these genes. Now, you know, we talk about dominant genes being capital letters, recessive genes being the small letters. It is much more complicated than this. That's what I want you to understand. Much more complicated. But Nonetheless, the basic principles, in looking at this way, the basic principles are the same, even though it's much more complicated. So if you have a male and female here, you can see this is a male dog, and here we have a female dog, and you've got these pairs of genes, big A, big B, little b, and so on. Then you get one set of genes from the male, one from the female. You know, sperm fertilizes egg, and you get an individual. And of course, you know, in the sperm and the egg, you have half the number of chromosomes as a result of meiosis. And so now we end up with all these different combinations here as a result of these two up here. Now I want you to look up here. Here are the two parent dogs. Now here we have all the offspring. But have a look at these offspring. They're all a little different combination to each other, but they all inherited that information from the original pair here. So if these are dogs, what are these down here? They're dogs, exactly. Now notice something. This one here has all big A's, big B's, big C's. It doesn't have the little A's, little B's, little C's, which means it's lost information. It doesn't have the little a, little b, little c information, but it still has the information to be a dog, but it's actually lost some variability because it's lost the variability in the little a, little b, little c. Now, I want you to think about this. How much variability do you think God put into the original gene pool? Well, I'm going to explain it this way. If you took one man and one woman from this audience, how many children do you think you could have? You get married, have kids. How big a family could you have without having two with the same combination? Million? Billion? Wonder how many possible combinations you could have. All right, well, let me tell you. You might be surprised at this. Does anyone know how many atoms there are in the universe? Has anyone ever counted them? Actually, scientists have estimated the number of atoms in the whole universe. It's about 10 to the 80th power. That's a 1 followed by 80 zeros. That number's so big you can't even think about it. You know what an electron is? You've heard of electrons, haven't you? Okay. If you packed electrons into the whole space of the universe, how many electrons do you think would fit into the space of the known universe? Scientists have estimated that. 10 to the 130th power. That's a 1 followed by 130 zeros. Now that number is even bigger, and I mean you can't even think that high. If you took one man and one woman from your genes, from your information storage system, your DNA, how much variability do you have that God inbuilt there to produce offspring? How many offspring, how many possible combinations could you have? Did you know an evolutionist has actually worked that out, and it comes to 10 to the 2017th possible combinations. I mean, that number is so large. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. By the way, there's a family if you want to aim for a family, okay? That really is a family right there. Now, I wanted you to understand that God put that same sort of variability in dogs, in cats, in elephants, as well as humans. So incredible variability in that DNA storage system. In fact, DNA is such a phenomenal storage system. There are scientists today that are looking at DNA to see if they can in some way use it to take computers to a whole nother level, a higher level of technology, because we sort of seem to be at the end of the limits of what man can do. So now we're looking at what God can do, which is so much greater than what man can do. Now, think in terms of biblical history, okay? You've got all this variability in our genes, and think of the event of Noah's Ark at the time of Noah's flood. God sent to Noah 2 of every kind of land animal, 7 of some, but 2 of every. 7 of the clean, right, but 2 of all the unclean. There's 2 of every kind. Now, dogs obviously would be classed as unclean. If all dogs are related, there's only one kind of dog. Therefore, how many dogs would have been on Noah's Ark? 2, exactly, 2 dogs. So we have 2 dogs on Noah's Ark, okay? They get off Noah's Ark, get married, have kids, and we end up with lots of dogs again. Only this time, what's going to happen? As the population builds up, do you realize they're not going to stay together, are they? They're not going to stay together in one place. And that really brings us to the point of what our next session is going to do as we talk about this in our final session that I'm doing in regard to using observational science to confirm the Bible's history. Now, others will do other subjects in this series, such as geology and talk about astronomy to show you how observational science confirms the Bible's history. But as we move into the final session here, I want you to be thinking like this. I want you to be thinking in terms of this. If you go back to look at those possible combinations I had from big A, big B, big C, little c, you imagine the amount of variability in the original dog kind that probably was represented as what was on Noah's Ark. God selected the dogs to go on Noah's Ark. Imagine the zillions of possible combinations of genes. As those dogs build up in population on the earth, are they going to stay together as one group? No, they're not going to stay together. Some are going to go north, south, east, west, aren't they? What do you think will happen as they go north, south, east, west? Are the same genes going to end up in each group?
No.
No, they're not. So do you start to get an inkling of what sort of can happen here? Different combinations of genes end up going in different directions, and different combinations end up surviving better in some areas than other areas. And actually that provides a basis for explaining why we get these different species and varieties of dogs through what's called adaptation and natural selection. Now I'm going to explain that in more detail in the next session to you, but I want you to understand that Christians can believe in natural selection. Christians can believe in adaptation. Not only can believe, we must believe, because that's observational science. I was at a conference just recently, and a young student came up to me and he said, look, I don't believe in evolution in the sense of molecules to man, but he said, I've been taught evolution at school and I've seen evolution work. And he said, I have to believe in some form of evolution, don't I? And I said, now, let me suggest to you what you're really talking about here. Are you talking about natural selection and speciation and changes you see within a kind like dogs? And he said, yes. I said, you were taught that's evolution, right? And he said, yes. I said, but that's not the same as molecules to man. And that's when he said, explain that to me. And so I went through and started explaining like this using genes and talking about the fact that, you know, with the creation model here, based upon Scripture, you start with the original kinds of animals and plants. You start with the original pools of information that God created. And then, over a period of time, as animals mix together and so on, then split apart, that pool gets diluted, and you might even lose information over time as animals die out and maybe lose genes. From an evolutionary perspective, you start with no information and you increase the amount of information, get increasing pools of information. And I said, you've got to understand something. Molecules to man evolution means you get brand new information that never previously existed that gets added in to the genes. Whereas when you start from the Bible, you start with all the information that God put there and you separate it out and you might lose some. It's the opposite of that evolutionary process. We have never seen a mechanism that produces information from matter. We've never seen matter produce a code. Remember that from one of the previous sessions that we did? And so what you're looking at in natural selection, here's the question to ask. Is it the addition of brand new information that never previously existed? The answer is no. It's the sorting out of the pool that's already there. And when you understand that, you realize when people use the word evolution for the changes within dogs, that has nothing to do with what's called Darwinian evolution, which means molecules to man. In fact, it's the opposite of molecules to man, because you're losing information, separating out information, you're not gaining information. So when you correctly understand natural selection, as we'll look into in more detail in the next session, as you correctly understand natural selection, you'll realize that we're looking at observational science that confirms the Bible statement, God made distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind, but is also observational science that actually goes against, dictates against the idea that one kind changes into another. In other words, the Bible's true. And again, without faith, it's impossible, but it's not a blind faith. We have a logical, reasoned defense of our faith. So let's leave it there for this session and get ready for the next session where we'll talk in natural selection in more detail and be thinking in your own mind, okay, after the flood we have this group of animals, group of dogs, and now they're not going to stay together, so what's going to happen? And that provides a basis for us for now launching into really understanding natural selection and its mechanism, and to see it actually confirms the Bible's history.